John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we're reading episode number 106, and before we get into that, just a little catch-up on what's been going on. In the last couple issues, we saw John trying to regain a bit of his edge after he separated himself into two different beings in order to trick the First of the Fallen once again. Now, when he did that, he took all the stuff that he didn't like about himself, all the evil and any kind of memories and whatnot, and he put those into the body that the First was going to take to hell. And it turns out that all that stuff was what gave John his edge, and him losing that kind of took away all his drive and determination. So in order to try to get some of that back, he did a bunch of trials to learn some stuff about his past, and eventually he came up with the plan to trick Chantanelli, the demon that was in hiding ever since she helped John take down the First of the Fallen in the Garth Ennis run. So what he did is he seduced her and basically took some evil out of her in the course of them having sex. And they didn't really explain how he extracted it from her, other than we can just assume he did it magically, maybe because he's such a good lover. I don't know. So now John is back to mostly his old self. He's got that little bit of evil that gives him that edge that he needs. So first things first, with issue 106, we got the cover. We see John standing in front of a bunch of houses that are all connected together, and he looks kind of surprised because the middle house that he's staring at kind of looks like it's got a green light shining on this whole area, like almost as if it just appeared before him. And that's kind of confirmed because we see on either side of the edges where this house is and the green light is enveloping it, there is a woman that was walking down the sidewalk and she's pushing a baby stroller, and the stroller and some of her arms and face are cut off by where the building and the light begins, and then it's reappearing on the other side where the building and light ends. Almost as if it's some kind of dimensional portal that no one can really see or feel, except John apparently, who is looking very surprised at this chunk of housing. And also hovering in green in front of the house, there is a soldier in full military fatigues, and he's maybe 3 times bigger than John. So John is probably seeing him too, and that is another reason why he's shocked, besides the fact that this house seems to be in some kind of dimensional rift. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Sean Phillips. And as we turn to the first page, we see a soldier standing in torso-high water, and he is raising his gun up above his head so it doesn't get wet. And it looks like it's an ocean or something because from the beach, we can see there's a bunch of artillery firing and explosions in the water around him. And some of those explosions are even landing really close to him, and his arms are getting shredded by some of the shrapnel from them. And over these panels, the narration says, "For 2 days, Jack stood in the water thinking of her. For 2 days, he hid in the roiling waves, walking in and out with the tide, keeping his rifle dry. For 2 days, he waited patiently under the devil-white glow of very lights, hoping beyond hope that a boat would come and take him home. That last night on the soft sandbanks of Dunkirk, he thought Jerry might hit him 1,000 times. They only got him once. Yet even when the shrapnel blew most of his left hand away, when his knuckles exploded into fragments of bone and pain, even then, he thought of only her." Then we get a flashback of how Jack got in this position, and we see he was fighting in a town, and his fellow soldiers and him just got overwhelmed by the Germans, so he decided to run out into the ocean and hide, and that's where he stayed. And over these panels, the narration continues, saying, "The 23rd Light Infantry had come across the French countryside in headlong retreat from Brussels. Somewhere outside Armentières, Jack and young Ted Meeks had lost their way. One moment it had been summery calm, and the next, he and Ted were choking on plasma, sulfur, and carbon hail. Private Meeks, 19-year-old son of a Watford ironmonger, had died calmly in the dirt as he told a funny story about home. He'd stared wistfully at his torn, charred stomach like a child who'd broken a favorite toy. In the end, Jack had no choice but to leave his mate's body to the Germans and save himself. He made a promise to take Ted's memories back home instead. He'd run past the dunes and barreled into the water under cover of darkness. The rest of the British Army, however, were still a mile up the coast. In the 2 days since Ted's death, Jack's fear had intensified with every passing second. But he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid he'd never see his girl again. Then we cut to some memories from Jack of him with his girl, and they're dancing by the edge of a lake, and they look like they're having a great time, and they're staring longingly in each other's eyes. And the narration continues. Jack kept himself awake with thoughts of afternoons on the common, and sun and ducks and honeysuckle perfume. He thought of her pretty face with its perfect flaws. Then we get a panel of another explosion next to him, and this one seems to rattle him, and he brings down his shredded left hand, and he grabs a locket around his neck, and the narration continues saying, Jack ran his fingers over the smooth, cold edges of the locket she'd given him. It had her picture in it. That way, she'd be with him wherever he went to war. And as we turn to the next page, we do see that this thought of her definitely gave him some hope, because he reaches back up with his damaged hand, and he grabs back onto his rifle and continues holding it over his head. And the narration continues saying, Jack couldn't die. He needed too desperately to live for her. And so he remained standing in the water for 2 days. And she stayed with him all that time, helping him keep his rifle dry. And we also see on this page that the name of the issue is In the Line of Fire, Part 1. Then we turn the page and we cut to John Constantine, and it seems he has stopped to talk to an older man who I don't think we've seen before, but he seems to know him because he asks, How's tricks then, Bill? And Bill answers, Not too good, boy, not too good. Got another bleeding ulcer on my leg, ain't I? And then Ben nods back to the open doorway of his house and he says, And she's never about to empty me colostomy bag when I need her. That's how it is when you're old, John. Nobody cares. And John starts saying, Yeah, but Ben just continues talking and cuts him off saying, All these bleeding fairy footballers, all they care about is money. I can't stand to watch it anymore. Bleeding waste of time. And as for me bloody pigeons, but Ben's thought is cut off by an older woman who appears in the doorway behind him with a set of tea, and she says to them, Woohoo, you boys. Fancy a cup of tea? And as she walks down the steps, John begins to look around the neighborhood and begins to notice the other neighbors around. He sees a man riding his bike, and another guy's fixing his car on the street, and then he sees some boys playing soccer, and while he's looking at this, his narration says, And so, life dotters on at number 78 Thrawler Rod Road. The street sighs with a languor accumulated over hundreds of years. A few houses down, someone moves out, someone else moves in, and nobody notices. As it changes, everything stays the same. Outside, another generation of World Cup heroes learning their trade against a brick wall. Another spotty kid wastes his teenage years fixing up another Morris Minor. And through it all, the one constant is number 78. It's the home to Bill, Nellie, 38 racing pigeons, and 28 million cups of tea. And as Nellie approaches John with the cups of tea, John takes one and then jokes, Saved by the Nell. And then Nellie goes back inside, and as she does, John lights a cigarette, and Bill kind of whispers to him, She's gone. Give us a drag then, son. And then the old man takes a puff of John's cigarette, and he begins to cough, saying, Silly old cow. She's killing me, boy. I swear she is. Then John and Bill finish their conversation, and as John leaves, Bill goes back inside his house, and John's narration says, Bill's an old mate of mine, an erstwhile denizen of the King's Head Saloon Bar. He stopped coming when his knee packed up for good last year. Mind you, that was almost a relief. I mean, he'd spent 20 years threatening to die on us any second, but he'd never had the decency to follow through with it. Still, he's one of those old irascible gits you like, you know? And besides, Nellie's a national treasure. That's why I still wander by from time to time, just to listen to the sound of the way things used to be. Funny though, I've always had a suspicion there was something here that someone was forgetting to tell me, or something obvious that I was missing. And as the narration says this, we see a section of this housing block that is highlighted in a fluorescent green, and it's not just the house, it's the street and the sidewalk and even the cars on the street. And on the border of this house where the green ends and begins, it's almost like it just split the world in two. So there was a car parked in front of this house, and the front of it is on one side of the house and the back of it's on the other. So this seems like a spatial anomaly where it's existing, but it's also not existing, but it's not affecting the real world because we can't see it. And like John said, he doesn't even see it, and that's why he's feeling like he's missing something. Then we turn the page and we cut to two white guys in business suits, and one of the guys seems like he's very determined and he's walking towards this row of housing, and the other guy's just following along. And the man in front says, I won't stand for it, Colin. And Colin's confused and he asks, Stand for what, Mr. McGillicuddy? Then Mr. McGillicuddy looks around the neighborhood and he says, bloody squatters. Give them half a chance, and before you know it, the entire area is infested with criminals. And then he notices some black men standing on a corner smoking, and he looks at them and says, darkies and crusties, Colin. Darkies and crusties. This used to be such a nice street full of nice people. Now look at it. And then his face gets even more sour looking, and he says, but we'll find them, wherever they're hiding. And when we do, we'll kick the dirty buggers out onto the street where they belong. Then we cut to a little while later as Mr. McGillicuddy and Colin seem to be searching for a specific house. And it seems like they're almost there, but they pass by the house that's in the spatial anomaly, and then Mr. McGillicuddy stops confused and says, this is odd. What was that number again? And as Colin flips through some pages on his clipboard, he says, number 80. It says here they've paid neither rent nor rates for well over 50 years. That's an awful long time in arrears, but Colin is cut off by Mr. McGillicuddy, who says, I should say so, bloody freeloaders. Where is it then? And of course they're confused because number 80 is in that spatial anomaly. So as they pass by door number 79, they don't see house number 80 in this fluorescent green. Their bodies just appear as if walking through a wormhole on the other side of that house to house number 81. And as they're looking around for this missing number 80, Colin says, well, that's just it, Mr. McGillicuddy. I think someone's made a mistake on the form. I don't think there is a number 80 on this street. Then we turn the page and we cut back to the past, and we're back at the beach in World War II, and Jack still has his arms over his head, but it does look like he's getting tired, and the narration says, Jack's arms felt as if they were locked above his head. The crashing of the water made his ears ache, and he couldn't feel his shattered hand anymore. Despite this, he consoled himself with thoughts of England. He'd weighed 1,000 different options, trying to decide what he might do upon his return home. And while he was having these thoughts, his head was leaning down, probably because he's tired, and then we see his head snap back up, and he has a crazy look on his face with his eyes wide, and as he continues thinking about what he will do when he returns home, his narration continues and it explains his crazy face as it says, maybe a lovely trip to the seaside, which is a bit of dark humor because he probably wouldn't want to go back to the ocean after this. Then we turn the page and we cut to Constantine, who is getting dropped off by Chaz in the same neighborhood he was at this morning. And it seems he can't get the idea that he was missing something here, so he's returned. And as John gets out of the cab, he leans back in and says to Chaz, thanks, Chaz. I owe you, mate. And Chaz replies, what? You just worked that out, did you? And then John motions with his head over across the street and he says, here, you come down this way a lot. You know who owns that old house? And Chaz seems confused and he says, Christ almighty, Constantine. At least wait till you get in the pub before you start talking like a tosser. There's no house there, you pillock. So it seems that maybe now, since John is looking for it, he sees this house, but Chaz doesn't. And John is very confused and he says, what? But Chaz is already driving away. And then John sees the neighbors doing yard work right next to unit number 80. And he walks over to them and says, oi, excuse me, lads. Who lives at number 80? And both the neighbors stop what they're doing and they look at him, and almost as if they're possessed, they say, no one. There's no such address. And at that exact moment, all of a sudden, John begins to get a pain in his head, and he begins to rub the bridge of his nose, and his narration says, and there, the old familiar headache begins. In that moment, I realize what's been occurring down the road for me all these years. Maybe I never noticed the house before because I wasn't supposed to, but I've changed in the last year. I can see things as they are now. Every place dreams differently, telling its story to anyone who cares to listen. This old house tosses and turns in a fitful doze. It twitches and murmurs in the night. Its dream is a reoccurring nightmare. So John walks away from the neighbors, who look like they're frozen in place, and he looks up in the window of unit number 80. And it kind of looks like there's something up there, so he decides to go in. And as he's about to cross the threshold, the possessed neighbors say to him, don't go in there. You'll be sorry. And as John reaches out for the door, his narration says, all the times I've been down this street, I never even saw what was right in front of my eyes. There's someone here, or something maybe. Something very powerful, protecting the place from prying eyes. And as John makes contact with the door, it seems the green light surrounds him, and it looks like he's getting shocked, and the narration says, as I step towards the decaying front door, the creaking of rusty hinges becomes a rasping deterrent. The rafters shift and settle. It's the house telling me to leave it alone, protecting itself with powerful emotion. And this part's cool because we get two panels right next to each other, one of John with his shocked face, And then a flashback panel back to World War II where Jack has a shocked face as well. So I'm not sure if John is seeing what happened to Jack in the past, but as we turn the page, we do see what happened to Jack, and he is catatonic as he's being pulled onto a fishing vessel. And as the fishermen put him down on the deck, he's just staring blankly ahead, and they begin to bandage his wounded arm. And over these panels, the narration says, Jack awoke to find he was being pulled from the sea. He cursed himself for his weakness as he fell exhausted into the arms of the Brittany fishermen. A shell whistled by overhead, but Jack could only hear the sound of the ocean. He'd beaten the Germans. His rifle barrel was dry. And the man bandaging Jack's arm is also in the military, and there are some more military personnel on the deck, and the medic looks up at one of them and says, Won't let go of his gun, sir. I think he's had it, the poor chap. And the man he was talking to answers, Leave him be then, Corporal. He's no good to anyone right now. And it seems that hearing that actually snaps Jack out of his catatonic state, and he closes his eyes, and we see a little smile appear on his lips. And the narration says, But Jack felt fine. He simply had no words to describe his incomparable moment of triumph. Then we see he's picturing what it's going to be like when he gets home and there's a parade and he's walking next to his girl. And the narration continues. He knew now that he'd see his girl again. Everyone would laugh and cheer and point. What a perfect romance, they'd say, as she and Jack promenaded through town. Look at the hero and his beautiful girl. And Jack continues to imagine as we see him and his girlfriend and they're back at the commons by the lake, and the narration continues. And afterwards, he'd take her down to the common. The ducks would splash as the sun set over their pond, and Jack would become drowsy on the scent of honeysuckle perfume. He'd give her back the locket then, as he'd once promised he would do. And as Jack is thinking about this, he says out loud, When I get home, I'm going straight to see my girl. And then he turns to a soldier next to him and he says, How about you? And this soldier looks in a lot worse shape than Jack. He's got bandages all over his head and even one over his eye, so that's probably missing. And this soldier doesn't answer, so he's probably not even awake. Then we turn the page and we see Jack is coming home and he's buying flowers for his girl. And over these panels, the narration says, The soot and the noise of Paddington Station made Jack's soul ache, but he straightened his back and he marched proudly on. All those weeks in the hospital, he'd waited for one wonderful moment, the moment when he'd get to see his girl again. And today, he was going to show up at her door with his medal and his locket and his love for her. He would declare his intentions to her father and sweep her off her feet with his one good hand. What a surprise it would be. But in the panels under the narration about him returning home and asking his girl's father if it was okay to propose to her, we see him arriving to her house and then the dad looking kind of angry and then the flowers being thrown onto the ground. So it seems the dad, at least, was not happy to see Jack return. Then we turn the page and we cut back to John, who's now inside the house and he's sitting on the bottom steps of the stairs. And it turns out that he did see all these memories as he went into the house and that flash occurred, because as he's sitting and smoking, he says, And that's why you stayed, isn't it, Jack? She wasn't there. Then from upstairs, we hear someone yell, Go away! But of course, John does the opposite and he stands up and he begins to walk up the steps and he says, I can't, mate, not yet. I won't hurt you, I promise. I just want to know what happened. So show me. Then we cut to some more memories from Jack that John is also seeing, and we see Jack staring at London, which is burning. And it looks like a bunch of bombs are being dropped on the city around him. And he's watching the city from a bridge across the Thames, I assume. And he's not really showing any emotion on his face as these bombs drop around him, and the narration says, When the air raid sirens went off, that was when he came out. He watched London burn across the river. As weary citizens cowered in underground stations and Anderson shelters, Jack would wander the incandescent streets, savoring the storm. He'd walk angrily through the deluge of twisted metal and white-hot flame, and dare the Germans to hit him. In the panel underneath that last line, we see him screaming at the sky, shaking his fist in the air, and we also see that his left hand is now a hook since it was damaged when he was at that battle before. Then we cut to Jack inside Unit 80, and he's staring out from the second floor window, and we just see him alone, sitting by himself at a table eating food, and the narration says, But mostly, he sat in his room watching the street outside, and waiting. When news came over the radio of victory in Europe, Jack listened emotionless. He'd wished for the millionth time that he'd succumb to the pull of the sandbanks instead of returning to this ignominy. Then we get some panels of a parade happening down his street, and we see him looking out the window watching all of this, and the narration continues. Then came V.E. night. As Jack watched out of his window, London cheered for its brave sons and daughters, but nobody cheered for him. And as Jack looks out of his window at this parade, it looks like he sees his girl walking amongst these other soldiers, but he could just be imagining it or just seeing a girl who looks like his girl and she's just reminding him of her. But this seems to upset him, and the narration continues saying, Jack knew now that he'd never be again with his girl. She would promenade with someone else, someone who was unfairly handsome, a calm, confident man with 2 good hands. Well, even a cripple could occasionally be useful, couldn't he? There were plenty of things a one-handed man could do, like tie a good strong knot, for example. Then we see Jack tying a noose out of some rope. Then we turn the page and we cut to the present, and as John gets upstairs, he yells, Jack, don't! But of course it's too late because that was the past. So as John bursts into the room, he finds the skeleton of Jack hanging from the ceiling, and it seems like John almost becomes possessed by fear because he instantly begins to run away down the stairs, and he's saying, Oh Christ, oh Christ! And as he runs through the house, the narration says, Jack's despair blends into my soul as I relive the helplessness of his last few moments. I'm choking on his anger and disgust, stricken by the fundamental certainty that life is just one long series of regrets. The psychic cinefilm of Jack's last desperate act causes my throat to constrict in sympathy as the rope burns my skin. Like Jack, I'm desperately scrambling for just one precious moment of security. Then we see John rush out of the house, and as he gets to the bottom of the front stoop, he falls to his knees and he begins to vomit. And as he finishes, we see someone walk up next to him and say, And you are? And of course, John doesn't know what's going on, but standing next to him is Mr. McGillicuddy. And as John looks up at him, he says, What? And Mr. McGillicuddy says, Your name. Who are you? And as John gets up and wipes his mouth, he doesn't answer, and Mr. McGillicuddy says, It doesn't really matter. I take it you do live here? And John answers, No, it belongs to a mate of mine. And as John is talking, we see Mr. McGillicuddy filling something out on his clipboard, and then he takes a piece of paper and he hands it to John and says, Yes, well, not for much longer, chappie. This is an eviction notice. Tell your friend he has 1 week, after which time we'll be back to remove him from the premises, with force if necessary. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So it seems now that John has run out of the house and began throwing up, that has somehow disturbed the illusion that Jack had put on the place, and this allowed Mr. McGillicuddy to see it. But we'll have to find out next time what happens with that. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com, and we will see y'all on the next one.